Have you ever faced a moment so desperate that you would give away your last treasure just to survive? Imagine a widow, worn by grief and hunger, stepping into a dusty frontier store with only her wedding ring left to trade for bread. Gold was all she had, but what if gold wasn't what she truly needed? In a world where storms, rustlers, and loneliness threatened to crush even the strongest spirits, Lila McKenna discovered that survival wasn't just about food or money. It was about choices whether to surrender to despair or to fight for a future she couldn't yet see. And what if, in that same moment, a rancher's son looked past her desperation and saw her strength? What if he told her that what the land and its people needed wasn't gold, but her put yourself there? Would you have the courage to believe him? Would you find the strength to rebuild, to love, and to claim a life forged from hardship? Stay with us as we step into this powerful, true-to-life tale of grit, love, and second chances. And before we begin, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss the stories that remind us all what really matters. The dust lifted in pale spirals around Lila McKenna's boots as she paused at the edge of Whitcomb's general store. The Red River Territory sun glared down without mercy, baking the wooden planks of the boardwalk until they seemed to shimmer. Her fingers trembled as she touched the small circle of gold resting in her palm, the only piece of her past life she had left. At 24, Lila was already a widow, stripped of everything but her name and this ring. Once, it had symbolized a promise spoken in Riverbend when her husband Nate Brooks slipped it on her hand, with hope shining in his eyes. Now it seemed no heavier than a useless pebble, its glow dulled by hunger and grief. She pushed open the store's creaking door, the bell above jingling weakly, and stepped into the dim coolness. The scent of burlap grain sacks, kerosene, and leather wafted through the air. Behind the counter stood Silas Whitcomb, a stout man with a fringe of graying whiskers and eyes that flicked from ledger to customer with the quickness of a hawk. "Please, Mr. Whitcomb," Lila murmured, sliding the band across the counter. The shopkeeper barely glanced at it. His thick fingers pushed it back toward her. "Ma'am, I told you before, folks out here can't eat gold. We need strong arms for planting, not shiny trinkets." His tone was not cruel, simply flat, as if hardened by too many similar pleas. Lila's stomach clenched at his words. She hadn't eaten a proper meal in 3 days, not since she spent her last coin on a stale biscuit back in the previous settlement. Pride had kept her from begging, but pride, she was learning, was a costly luxury. "Just a bit of bread," she whispered, "or cornmeal, anything at all." The bell above the door chimed again. Lila kept her gaze fixed on the counter, desperate to will compassion from the man before her. She thought of Nate, of how he had worked for months in Riverbend just to afford that simple ring. Now, in her hands, it held less worth than a loaf of bread. "Problem here. Whitcomb." A deep voice came from behind her. "No trouble, Mr. Stone," the shopkeeper replied quickly. "Just explaining we don't trade in gold." Lila turned. A tall man had entered, his frame lean but strong, shoulders broad from long days in the saddle. His skin bore the bronze of the sun, and his clothes, canvas trousers, a blue work shirt, and a leather vest were well cared for, but practical. Not a townsman, she thought, but not a drifter either. He tipped his wide-brimmed hat politely. "Ma'am," his eyes, green as prairie grass after rain, swept over her worn dress and hollow cheeks with a single quick, measuring glance. "I was just leaving," Lila managed, reaching for the ring. Her hand shook as she tried to gather her composure. "That's a wedding band," he observed quietly. She gave a faint nod, unable to form words. "Whitcomb," the man said, his voice calm but steady. "Give the lady some provisions. Put them on my account." The shopkeeper blinked. "Now, Mr. Stone, my account." "Silas," the man repeated, firmer this time. Then he turned to Lila. "Ma'am, I don't mean to presume, but gold isn't what we need out here. You are—" Her breath caught. "I beg your pardon. My father runs Stone Creek Ranch, about 5 miles north," he explained. "We lost our cook last month when she married and moved west to Silver Ridge. We've got 8 ranch hands who can rope a steer blindfolded but can't boil beans without burning them. If you can cook and don't shy from hard work, there's a place for you. Room, board, and wages." Lila's throat tightened. Once, she had been the wife of a merchant in Everton County, secure in her small home until fever took Nate and the bank claimed the rest. Cooking for ranch hands had never figured in her dreams, but neither had starving on the prairie. "I can cook," she admitted, her voice low. "Then we'd be obliged if you'd consider the position." He turned back to Whitcomb. "Give her proper supplies for the road." The shopkeeper grumbled but began filling a basket with cornmeal, beans, salt pork, and even a small sack of sugar. Meanwhile, the stranger's green eyes studied Lila again, steady and without pity. "When did you last eat a real meal?" he asked. A spark of pride flared in her. "That's not your concern. Mr. Stone, Caleb Stone. He supplied, and it is my concern if you're to work for us. Can't have you fainting into the stew pot." His tone was matter-of-fact, but not unkind. "There's a boarding house across the street," he added. "Agnes Mallory serves a fair noon meal. Eat and rest. I'll be back with the wagon in 2 hours. I haven't accepted your offer." "No, Rame, you haven't. But you're thinking on it. Otherwise, you'd already be walking away." He set several coins on the counter. "For Mrs. Mallory. See the lady gets there safely," he told Whitcomb. Then he tipped his hat once more and strode out. At the door, he paused, glancing back. "Keep your ring. Mrs. McKenna? Lila McKenna? Mrs. McKenna. Keep it. Out here we don't trade away our memories. We just learn to carry them different." When he was gone, Whitcomb handed her the basket, heavier now with food than she'd dared hope for. "Caleb Stone's a decent man," he said grudgingly. "His father, too. It's honest work they're offering." Lila nodded, clutching the provisions in one hand and the ring in the other. Through the window she glimpsed Caleb mounting his horse with practiced ease. He paused a moment, turned, and lifted a hand to the brim of his hat before riding off in a small cloud of dust. The Mallory boarding house stood across the way, a 2-story clapboard with paint peeling from its shutters. Inside, Agnes Mallory, a wiry woman with sharp eyes, ushered Lila toward a table near the kitchen. "Caleb Stone sent you. Did he? Good boy, that one. Shame about his mother passing last spring. The ranch hasn't been the same without a woman's hand on it." She set down a plate of beef stew and cornbread. "Eat up, dear. You look like a stiff wind might carry you clean to Maple Crossing." The food was plain but hearty, and Lila forced herself to chew slowly, though her body screamed for more. Pride might be fading, but she clung still to her dignity. She turned the ring in her hand, remembering Nate's face as he'd slipped it on her finger years ago in Riverbend. So proud of their beginning together. "Nothing wrong with finding a new direction," Agnes remarked, noticing her distant gaze. "This land is full of folks starting over. Some running from something, some chasing after it. The lucky ones find what they need." 2 hours later, Lila stepped onto the boarding house porch, her few belongings in a worn carpet bag and the heavy basket at her feet. The steady rumble of wagon wheels reached her before she saw Caleb turn the corner, reins in hand, the afternoon sun at his back. Caleb handled the team with the same quiet skill Lila had seen in the store. He guided the wagon to the curb, set the brake, and stepped down in one smooth motion. "Mrs. McKenna," he said, lifting her carpet bag as if it weighed nothing, "decided to take a chance on us. It seems I have little choice." "There is always a choice," he replied, voice easy rather than sharp. "Sometimes one road just looks better than the other." He set her bag in the wagon bed and offered a hand for balance as she climbed up to the wooden seat. The boards were sun-warmed, and the leather reins smelled faintly of oil and dust. "We are a fair piece out," he said, "but we will beat sundown if the trail holds." Lila looked once more at the small town behind them, Whitcomb's General Store, where she had nearly traded away the last bright link to her old life. The Mallory boarding house, where kindness had worn a practical apron and set a heavy bowl of stew in front of her. The dusty street where desperation had made everything feel narrower than a thread. She folded her fingers over the ring in her pocket and settled forward. "Second thoughts?" Caleb asked, gathering the lines. "No second thoughts." The wagon rolled out with a creak of axles and the rhythmic clop of hooves. The prairie opened in wide sheets of color, grass bending and unbending in the wind like the breath of some great animal. Overhead, the sky arched pale and endless, a blue bowl with a few stray clouds like scraps of cotton. The land did not promise anything. The land simply was. "Your father will not mind you hiring a stranger?" Lila asked when the town had flattened into a mirage behind them. "He trusts my judgment," Caleb said. "Besides, out here every person is a stranger until they have shared a season or two." He glanced at her. "The ring, your husband fever," she said. "6 months ago I'm sorry for your loss." They rode a while without speaking. The wagon complained softly. The harness jingled now and then. Far off, a hawk circled slow and patient. Lila felt the sway of the wheels through the wooden seat and matched her breathing to the small movements. The rhythm steadied her. "My mother used to say the prairie strips away the soft." Caleb said finally, "If you are strong enough to stand it, it gives back a quieter softness. The kind that knows how to last." Lila turned that idea over like a cool stone. Her old life had been soft in the ways that make a person unprepared for hunger and wind and loss. That life was gone. Yet she was still here. She was still moving. Perhaps that was a kind of strength she had not known to claim. By late afternoon the light went honey gold. Caleb pointed with his chin. "There." At first all she saw were shapes against the grass. Then the shapes took on edges. A clapboard house with a deep porch shaded by a short line of cottonwoods. A big red barn with doors thrown wide. A lower building long as a railroad car that had to be the bunkhouse. Cattle moved like dark pebbles across the pasture, and a ribbon of smoke rose straight up from the chimney until the wind caught it and smeared it away. Measured against a city back in Everton County, it would not have seemed like much. Set against miles of open country, it felt like a small declaration. "We will hold here. Welcome home," Caleb said. "Such as it is." Lila sat taller. The woman who had married Nate in Riverbend had been sheltered and certain. That woman had been buried with him. What remained was someone the land itself was shaping, tempering, testing. She touched the ring in her pocket once, not to part with it, but to decide how to carry it. Caleb had been right. Memory was not a thing to be pawned. It was a thing to be born. They rattled to a stop in front of the porch just as the sun touched the western rim of earth and sky. Before Caleb could circle the wagon, a man stepped out of the house. He was older, shoulders still straight, face signed by weather and work. The likeness between him and Caleb sat plain in the line of jaw, and the clear, steady look, Pa," Caleb said, hoisting down the carpet-bag. "This is Mrs. McKenna. She has agreed to take the cook's work." Amos Stone touched 2 fingers to the brim of his hat. "Ma'am." "My boy tells me times have been hard. I am willing to work," Lila said, meeting his gaze. "That is what matters now." Something eased in the older man's expression. "Fair enough. Supper is at 6 sharp. Men get sour as green apples if they have to wait. We are glad you are here. Been too long since that kitchen was run proper." The kitchen was larger than Lila expected and in worse shape than she wanted it to be. A big iron stove sat like a black heart in the middle of the far wall. A work table bore the scars of knives and kettles. Shelves held flour and beans and jars of preserves, all dusted with neglect. Pans piled in a sink told a long, sad story of men doing their best and failing loudly. "I know it is a sight," Caleb said, setting her bag in a corner. "The boys tried it as fine," Lila said, already rolling up her sleeves. "I will need water heated for cleaning, and someone should show me where you keep everything. I will fetch water." Caleb said without hesitation, "Your room is through that door. It used to be a pantry till Ma had it turned. Small but private." The little room was just as he promised. A narrow bed, a washstand with a dull mirror and a clean basin, a window that looked toward the barn and took in a slice of sky. Lila set her folded dress and a single spare on the bed, then returned to the kitchen where the work waited. "How many men will I be feeding?" she asked. 8 hands, Caleb called back as he pumped the well handle into wooden buckets. "Pa and me besides. More when roundup comes, or we hire extra riders. They eat like they earn it." He set the water on the stove to heat. Lila moved through the space with quiet purpose, taking stock. Flour enough to get through the week. Cornmeal plenty. Beans stacked deep as winter was long. Salt pork in the cool box. Coffee beans in a tin that made her smile when she opened it. The root cellar held potatoes and onions. There was enough to begin, and she would stretch it where she could. "What time do the men rise?" she asked first light. Caleb said, "Coffee by 5 sets the day right. If that is too much on a first morning, I will manage," Lila said. She sorted the pans and tested the stove dampers, listening to how the heat pulled through the vents. She set the worst of the pots aside to be scoured with sand and made a mental list of what could not be saved at all. She found a sack of coarse salt and a small tin of pepper and tucked both near the stove where her hands would find them. Without looking, Amos stepped into the doorway and took in the scene. He did not smile, but approval sat in the way his shoulders dropped a fraction. "We will give you room to work. Ma'am, I will take the men to wash at the pump. Caleb, see to the wood." Caleb stacked split oak by the stove until it stood shoulder high. He kept glancing toward Lila without hovering, ready to fetch whatever she pointed at, respectful of the way she was already claiming the space. "When did you last eat a proper meal?" he had asked her earlier. Now he did not repeat the question. He simply set a clean enamel mug by the wash basin and filled it with cool water from the bucket. While the water heated, Lila set to cleaning. She scrubbed the table with hot water and soap until the boards smelled fresh. She scoured the pans with sand and elbow grease and set them to dry in a neat row that would make sense to her at dawn. She swept the floor from back door to front, sending out a small storm of crumbs and grit. She found a clean apron behind the door and tied it snug. Caleb reappeared with a small sack. "Coffee sugar," he said. Payment from Whitcomb already squared. "Thank you." He nodded toward the little room. "If you are missing anything for the morning, write it on a list. I ride to town again in 3 days for salt blocks and harness oil." They worked in an easy quiet. Dusk gathered against the windows. From the yard came the low sounds of men washing trail dust from their faces and the soft nicker of horses settling in their stalls. Lila measured flour and cut in lard with 2 knives, the blades clicking steady, then stirred in buttermilk until the dough came together under her hands. The feel of it was both new and familiar. Work is a language a person never forgets once they have learned it. By the time the first stars were winking on, a pot of beans simmered with onion and a bit of pork rind, the smell turning the air warm and promising. Cornbread batter rested in a bowl. Thick slices of salt pork waited on a plate, ready for the skillet. It was not fancy food, but it would meet men where their hunger lived. The front door opened, and Boots crowded the porch. Caleb poked his head around the corner. "You want them now or in 10? "Now," Lila said. "Tell them to wash their hands, and tell the youngest to mind his elbows." Caleb grinned. That would be Toby. The men filed in with an awkward respect that made her want to smile and not smile at the same time. Hats came off. A few mumbled, "Good evening." Lila served steady and quick, and the long table settled into the kind of silence that only good food earns on a working ranch. Amos took the head of the table. Caleb sat to his right. After the first bites, the room changed. Shoulders unhitched. A breath went out that had been held all day without anyone knowing it. The youngest hand, who must have been Toby, made a soft sound, and then caught himself when Amos raised an eyebrow. "Mrs. McKenna," Amos said at last, "splitting a biscuit to stack with salt pork. That is the best meal this house has seen in a long stretch. We are obliged." "Thank you, sir," Lila said, surprised by how much the words mattered in her chest. When the plates were empty and the cornbread down to crumbs, Lila rose to clear. Caleb stood with her and took a stack of plates to the wash basin without comment. "Pa always made us help with dishes," he said. "No cause to change what worked." "You do not have to," she began. He handed her a clean towel. "I know." They worked side by side, while the men drifted out to the porch to talk over the day and trade quiet jokes. Through the open window, Lila could hear low laughter, the kind that rides easy on tired bones. The kitchen already felt different, a place shaped by hands and heat and purpose. Caleb dried the last plate and hesitated. "There is a milk cow in the barn," he said. "Daisy, gentle as a dog and twice as patient. If you want fresh milk for baking, I can show you the ropes after supper some evening." "I would like that," she said, then added before she could think better of it, "Your mother must have run this kitchen well." "She did," Caleb said softly. "It has been too quiet since she passed. I will do my best to honor her ways and still find my own." "You already have," he said. When the kitchen was set to rights and the stove banked for morning, Lila stood in the doorway of her little room and looked back. The neat row of pans, the swept floor, the mug on the washstand. It was not yet home, but it was the beginning of one. She closed her hand around the ring in her pocket and felt its shape. She did not need to wear it tonight to remember. She only needed to keep moving forward. Before she slept, she made a list by lamplight: coffee to grind in the morning, biscuits at 4, gravy from the drippings, potatoes sliced thin for the skillet, extra water heating by the time the first boots hit the porch. She folded the paper and set it beneath a cup on the table where she would see it even with sleep still in her eyes. Outside, the prairie wind moved through the cottonwoods with a sound like low surf. Horses blew softly in their stalls. Somewhere a coyote called and another answered. Lila lay down on the narrow bed and stared at the square of starlight on the ceiling. She imagined the men sitting on the porch benches, Amos with his hands folded, Caleb with that watchful ease that missed nothing, and felt something loosen inside her that had been taught for months. Tomorrow would come early. she would meet it. "They'll be looking for coffee and breakfast by 5, Caleb said, glancing at her as he stacked kindling by the stove. "I know it is asking a lot, starting so soon." Lila gave him a brief smile as she examined a dented pot. "I will manage." She tested the rim with her fingers, judged it too bent to hold water without leaking, and set it aside with the others beyond saving. "Caleb," she said, "where is the nearest stream for washing 50 yards behind the house?" he answered, filling another bucket from the pump. "We haul the water in. Easier that way." He hesitated, then cleared his throat. "Mrs. McKenna, about what I said back in town." She looked up from scrubbing a pan, her hands still wet. "Yes. When I said gold is not what we need. But you are. I meant it. This ranch does not run on pretty things. It runs on work, grit, and trust. Every man here has a loss he carries. What matters is what we build with the day we have." Her reply was cut short by the sudden slam of the door. Boots thudded across the floorboards as the ranch hands came piling in, drawn by the sight of warm water and by the rumor of a woman finally running the kitchen. They were a rough set, faces darkened by sun and dust, shoulders broad from labor. Some carried the restless energy of youth, others the deliberate caution of age. At a glance, Lila counted at least 8 of them, ranging from a tow-headed boy not yet 20 to a weathered man whose beard was silvered with years. "Boys," Caleb said firmly, standing between them and the work table, "this is Mrs. McKenna, our new cook. You mind your manners." There was a shuffle of boots, muttered greetings, and hats tugged off in awkward respect. The youngest, freckles spread across his nose, blurted out, "Ma'am, does this mean no more of Gus's beans?" A roar of laughter followed. A burly fellow with a thick mustache crossed his arms. "Hey now, Toby, my beans ain't that bad." "Your beans could chew a horse," another voice called from the back, and more laughter erupted. "Enough," came Amos Stone's steady voice from the doorway. The room quieted at once. "Mrs. McKenna's got work to do. Supper at 6. Clear out and let her see to it." The men filed out reluctantly, but Lila caught a flicker of hope in their eyes as they went. When the door shut, she turned to Caleb. "Is there coffee?" she asked. "They expect it every morning," he said, his tone lighter. "I will show you where we keep the beans and how the stove draws best." For the next hour he guided her through the details of the kitchen where the flour was stored in barrels, which pans warped too easily, how the stove's dampers pulled heat. His patience surprised her, and she felt some of the tightness inside her chest ease. "Your mother?" Lila asked carefully as she seasoned a pot with oil. "She taught you these things?" "Some," Caleb said, his hands busy at the water bucket. "I was the youngest. Spent more time near the house than my brothers." A shadow passed over his face. "They are gone now. The war took them. Just Pa and me here now. The war. It had taken so many, breaking families and leaving women to pick up the pieces." Lila did not ask which side out here mattered less than survival. By sundown she had the kitchen cleared, the worst pans scoured, and a simple supper ready, beans properly seasoned, cornbread crisp at the edges, salt pork fried to a golden crackle. The smell drifted through the house and out to the yard. At 6 sharp, the men crowded in with eager faces, hats tucked under arms. Amos took the head of the table. Caleb sat at his right, and the others filled in, hands restless on the wood until plates were set down. The first bite brought silence so complete Lila could hear the faint ticking of the stove. Then Toby, the young one, let out a sound close to a moan. "Ma'am," he said, cheeks flushing red. This is food. Eat it while it is hot, Lila said crisply, though the corner of her mouth threatened to lift. She watched the men eat with genuine hunger, plates scraped clean, eyes lighting at the offer of seconds. She had made plenty, expecting just this, and felt a quiet satisfaction as the platters emptied. "Mrs. McKenna," Amos said when the last crumb was gone. "That was a meal worth waiting for. First one in too long." His voice was simple, but the honesty in it warmed her more than praise dressed in fancy words. The others murmured agreement, and she caught Caleb watching her with something that looked like gratitude. When the table was cleared, Lila carried the dishes to the basin. She had barely rolled up her sleeves when Caleb appeared at her side with a towel. "You do not have to," she began. "My mother made us all help with dishes," he said, taking a plate from her hands. "No reason to change now." Together they worked, the clatter of crockery softened by the rhythm of water and cloth. "The men are already talking about breakfast," Caleb said with a half-smile. "Toby offered to rise early if it means biscuits on the table." "I will tend the fire myself," Lila said, though she felt pleased despite herself. It had been a long while since anyone had appreciated her efforts. "You did well tonight," Caleb said quietly. "I knew you would." "You knew nothing about me," she answered, her tone sharper than she intended. "Only that I was desperate enough to trade my wedding ring for bread." "I knew you carried pride even through hunger," he replied. "I saw the way you looked at that ring. It was not just gold. It was memory. And you did not beg, even when begging might have worked. Folks show who they are in the hard moments. Mrs. McKenna, what I saw was someone who bends but does not break." His words settled deep, warming places inside her that had been cold for months. She turned back to the dishes, hiding her face. "Fine words," she muttered. "But I am just a cook now, nothing more." "There is nothing wrong with honest work," Caleb said. "And please, just Caleb. Mr. Stone is my father." They finished the dishes in easy silence. When the last plate was dried, Caleb reached into his vest pocket. He pulled out a small cluster of prairie flowers, already wilted at the edges. "Picked these on the way back from town," he said, his voice almost shy. "Thought your room might feel more like home. Ma always liked flowers in the house." The gesture caught her off guard. She accepted them carefully. "Thank you, Caleb." He nodded, turned toward the door, then paused. "Mrs. McKenna, you said you are just a cook. You are wrong. You are someone who chose to rise out of the ashes and build something new. That takes courage. Most people never find." Lila looked down at the flowers in her hands, the faintest trace of color against the rough wood of the table. For the first time in a long while, she felt the weight of her loss shift just slightly. Not gone, but carried different. After Caleb left, Lila stood alone in the quiet kitchen with the small bouquet in her hands. Through the window she could see light leaking from the bunkhouse and hear the low rise and fall of tired voices, the occasional burst of laughter that meant the day had ended without disaster. Above the yard, a scatter of stars pushed through the dusk. More than she had ever seen back in Everton County. She found a clean jar, filled it with a little water, and set the prairie flowers on the sill in her room where the last of the evening would find them. As she unpinned her hair, her fingers went to the pocket where her wedding ring rested. Nate would have liked Caleb Stone, she thought. He would have respected a man who spoke plain and kept his promises. For the first time in months, the thought of Nate brought a tender ache instead of the sharp cut that had lived under her ribs since the fever. Morning would come early, fires to coax from last night's embers, bread to start, coffee strong enough to put men on their feet. It would be harder work than anything she had known as a merchant's wife, but it was honest labor, and it came with a roof and with faces that looked at her with hope instead of pity. Lila lay down on the narrow bed, boots set neatly by the frame, and closed her eyes. Just before sleep took her, she remembered Caleb's eyes when he handed her those flowers, green as new grass after rain. Something moved in her chest that she had not felt in a long time, not quite hope, but the shape of it. The rooster made himself heard long before dawn. For a heartbeat, Lila reached out across the bed for a familiar warmth that was not there. Then the small room came back into focus, with its single window and the faint gray of morning edging the glass. Stone Creek Ranch. Day 1. She dressed quickly, pinned her hair back, tied on the apron she had scrubbed clean, and stepped into the kitchen. The room was as cold and still as a church. She lifted the stove lid, found the banked coals waiting, and breathed life into them with kindling and patience. Water went on to heat. Flour and lard and a pinch of salt met under her hands. She cut the dough, set biscuits in neat rows, and stirred coffee grounds into the pot as the first soft light touched the porch. By the time boots thumped on the steps, the kitchen smelled like something a man could point himself toward and know the day would be all right. The door pushed open, and Toby, the tow-headed boy with freckles, stuck his head in and sniffed the air like a hopeful hound. "Morning, ma'am. That is coffee I smell. It will be ready when you are," Lila said. "Breakfast at 5 means breakfast at 5. Not a minute before." She softened it with a small smile, and the boy beamed, then backed out to wait with the others. Outside she could hear them gathering, voices low, the scrape of a bench across wood. At the stroke of 5 she opened the door. "Breakfast is served." The men came in with more order than the night before, taking the places the house had taught them to take over years of habit. Amos sat at the head. Caleb passed behind Lila with a nod, and she noticed hay seeds clinging to his shirt. "Morning chores," he said simply when he caught her glance. Horses pay no mind to a clock. She worked fast. Biscuits split and stacked. Gravy stirred from last night's drippings until it ran like silk. Skillet potatoes fried to a good brown. Thick slices of salt pork crisped on the edges. Coffee poured and poured again. The first pot vanished so quickly she ground more beans and set a second to boil before she poured a cup for herself. "Mrs. McKenna," Amos said as he reached for his third biscuit. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" "My mother in Maple Crossing taught me the bones of it," Lila said. "Then my husband." Her voice thinned for a breath, and she cleared her throat. "A woman learns what she needs to learn." "We are grateful for your learning," said an older hand with a leathered face and kind eyes. "Name is Jed," he added, as if remembering his manners. "I have not tasted biscuits this light since my own mother's table." The praise warmed her better than the coffee. As the men pushed back their chairs and reached for hats and gloves, Caleb lingered at the door. "The supply wagon goes to town at the end of the week," he said. "Make a list of what you need. Pa already told me to get whatever makes the work easier. That is generous. It is practical," he said. "Good food keeps good hands." He paused, then added, "There is a milk cow in the barn. Daisy, gentle sort. If you want fresh milk for baking, I can show you the tricks after supper." "I would like that," Lila said. The morning ran fast once the house emptied. She scoured what was left to scour, set the worst pans in a row for another round of sand and effort, and drew up an inventory in her head. The root cellar held more than she first realized. Potatoes mounted in crates, yellow onions braided on a nail, a few jars of peaches that would be gone in a single dessert, but worth it when a hard day needed a sweet ending. Out back, she found a garden plot, choked with weeds but still squared off neat as if someone had loved it once. She knelt in the dirt, pulled a handful of weeds, and found a line of stubborn herb shoots still alive. Work for another day. Closer to noon, she packed a basket for the hands, cold biscuits, a round of cheese, sliced dried beef, and 2 apples she found tucked in a corner bin. When she struck the triangle bell at the door, Caleb came up from the pasture, hat pushed back and sweat darkening his shirt in a wide patch between the shoulders. "They are grateful," he said, taking the basket. "Gus usually tosses hardtack in a sack and calls it lunch." "Hardtack," Lila repeated, half horrified, half amused. No wonder beans tasted like celebration to them. Caleb let out a rough laugh, as if the muscles that made that sound had not been used in a while. "Ma'am, you could serve boot leather and they would thank you for it, long as it was not Gus doing the cooking." "I will aim higher than boot leather," she said, and surprised herself by smiling back at him when he was gone. Lila turned the kitchen and small yard into a rhythm that made sense to her. Water heating, dough resting, knives sharpened on the stone. A quick sweep made slower when the wind drifted grit back under the door. She took stock of the coffee tin again, checked the flour barrel, and wrote a list on the back of a scrap. Coffee beans, baking powder, a fresh sack of salt. She added kitchen twine and new dishcloths, then tucked the list under a sugar bowl so she would not lose it in the rush of evening. From the porch she could see the land widening to every side. The bunkhouse sat still in the white noon light. Cattle moved in slow lines, their heads dipping and rising. A hawk drew circles as neat as if they had been traced with pencil. The place was not hers yet, not fully, but standing there with the smell of coffee in the air and bread cooling on the table, Lila felt something like the first plank laid in a new foundation. She had just wiped the table when afternoon brought company she was not expecting. The sound of hooves came from the yard, steady and sure. Voices followed, Caleb's and others she did not know. Lila stepped to the doorway and looked out. 3 riders sat their horses near the hitch rail. Dust lay on them like another layer of clothing, and their eyes had the sharp, measuring look of men who had seen hard country. Caleb dismounted and motioned them toward the house. "Mrs. McKenna," he said when he reached the porch, "these gentlemen are looking for work. We are heading into busy weeks and could use extra hands. Thought they ought to know we have a real cook now." To the men he added, "The kitchen is Mrs. McKenna's. Her rules stand." The taller one with a thin scar through his eyebrow raised 2 fingers to his hat. "Name is Boone Mercer. This here is Roy Calder." The third hung back and said nothing, studying the yard with a watchful stillness that felt colder than the shade. Lila kept her tone even. "Supper is at 6. Men who work, eat. Men who do not work, move on." Boone smiled without warming. "Fair enough, ma'am. Been a long spell since we had home cooking." When they led their horses toward the corral, Lila felt a tremor pass through her shoulders, quick and uninvited. She had stood behind a counter back in Riverbend and seen men rougher than these try to throw their weight around. She knew the look of men who came to take measure of a place. She also knew the look of a man who set himself as a wall. Caleb stood easy at the rail, but nothing about his attention was soft. He came back up the steps and paused just inside the door. "You all right? I'm fine," she said. Then, because there was no use in lying to a man who watched as closely as he did, she added, "They put me on edge." "Trust your sense," Caleb said. "We need hands, but not the kind that cause trouble in the house. I will make the rules plain. If any of them forget, they can keep going. You have my word." "Thank you," Lila said. She did not know she had needed to hear it until she did. Afternoon passed into the long shadows that mean supper is coming, and Lila went back to work. She kneaded dough and set it aside, cut potatoes and onions for the skillet, sliced salt pork, checked the beans, and tasted the broth until the seasoning sat just where she wanted it. She placed plates in stacks, pulled cups down, and set knives and forks in neat rows. The lamps were trimmed and ready. The pump was primed, and the floor was swept one last time. When the bell rang at 6, the men came in. The old hands first, the new ones a step behind, watching and weighing. Lila served steady while Amos kept order with a glance, and Caleb moved along the bench with that quiet mix of care and authority that held the table together. Conversation stayed low, but easy, carried on the back of full plates and the comfort of a hot meal after work. Afterward, Caleb took a towel and stood beside her at the basin again, as if the day were not complete until the kitchen was set to rights. They washed and dried and put away. The window opened to the night sounds of the yard. When the last plate was stacked and the fire banked low, he reached for his hat. "There is milk to be had from Daisy if you are ready to learn the ropes," he said. "Not tonight," Lila answered with a smile, the good kind of tired settling into her bones. "Tomorrow will come early." "It will," he agreed, "and it will be better because of what you started today." When she stepped back into her little room, the flowers were still there on the sill, pale heads bowed as if in prayer. Lila touched a petal with the tip of one finger. Then she took out her ring and held it up to the lamplight. She did not put it on. She did not hide it away. She set it beside the flowers and stood a moment, listening to the soft hum of a house that had begun, in the smallest of ways, to feel like it might one day be hers. Lila was scrubbing the long ranch table when the sound of horses drifted in through the open window. She paused, brush in hand, listening. Voices followed the low timbre of Caleb's and others she did not recognize. Her gaze went to the yard. 3 riders had pulled up at the hitch rail, their mounts coated in trail dust. The kitchen door creaked open, and Caleb stepped inside with 2 of the men. The third lingered outside, watching the place with eyes that missed little. These new arrivals were worn from the road, their clothes sun-bleached, their faces set with that hard expression of men who had traveled long miles and trusted few. "Mrs. McKenna," Caleb said, his tone even. "These fellows are asking after work. Figured they ought to know we have a proper cook now." He turned toward them, voice firm. "This kitchen belongs to Mrs. McKenna. Her word is the rule here." The taller of the 2 visitors tipped his hat. A thin scar cut through his left brow, and his gaze lingered on her longer than she liked. "Ma'am," he said smoothly, "name's Wade Mercer. This here's Roy Calder." Something about Wade's steady look raised the fine hairs at the back of Lila's neck. "Still," she kept her voice steady. "Gentlemen," Wade's lips curved, though his eyes stayed sharp. "If Mr. Stone puts us on, we'll take meals with the hands. Been a spell since we've had food cooked proper." "The men eat at 6, Lila replied. "Those who work, eat?" "Fair enough," Wade said with a smile that carried no warmth. When they stepped out, her hands trembled against the wood she was cleaning. She gripped the table until her knuckles whitened, angry with herself for showing it. Back in Everton County, she had dealt with all kinds of men at Nate's store. Rough ones, too. Yet there was something about Wade's measuring eyes that reminded her keenly of how alone she was here, one woman among strangers. A knock on the door pulled her back. Caleb stood in the frame, his brow furrowed. "You all right, fine," she answered quickly, then let out a slow breath. "No, they made me uneasy." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "Trust your instincts. I'm not sure of them myself, but we need the help. Roundup's on its way." His eyes searched hers. "I'll make the rules plain. Any one of them crosses the line with you, they're gone." The certainty in his voice steadied her heart. "Thank you," she murmured. He shifted, dragging a hand through his hair. "Ma would tan my hide if I didn't look after folks under this roof." He caught himself, his tone softening. "Point is, you're under this roof now. That counts for something." Before she could reply, he was gone, drawn back into the endless tide of chores. But his words stayed, warming a part of her chest that had been cold for months. That evening, the new men joined the table. Wade and Roy ate heartily, though their eyes kept roaming, sizing up the house, the land, the men. The third, Doyle, said little, but the way he watched spoke volumes. The usual chatter among the hands was thinner, strained by the presence of outsiders. Only young Toby kept his bright spirit, describing the day's fence mending with boyish energy until Samuel hushed him with a sharp glance. After the meal, Caleb kept his promise and led Lila to the barn. He introduced her to Daisy, a brown and white cow who blinked at her with calm eyes. "She's gentle," he said, showing her how to approach, how to rest her head near the flank, how to set the stool. Ma always said milking gave her time to think. Quiet time. Lila laid a hand against the cow's warm side. Daisy flicked her tail and shifted her weight. Unconcerned, the simple touch grounded her in a way she hadn't expected. "Your mother must have been wise," she said softly. "She was," Caleb replied, his voice carrying the kind of grief that had been worn smooth but never lost. "This place feels different without her. Pa does his best, but there are things a woman sees that men miss. She'd put flowers on the table, curtains at the windows, little things that made this more than just a bed between days of work." Lila thought of the wilting blooms in her room. "Is that why you brought me those flowers yesterday?" A faint color rose in his weather-browned cheeks. "Maybe. Seemed like something she'd have wanted me to do." They stood in the barn's gentle dimness, the rustle of hay and Daisy's steady breath filling the silence. It was not the silence of loneliness. It was companionable, a space shared without need for words. "I should get back," Lila said at last. "Morning comes early. I'll walk you." It was only a short way to the house, but she did not argue. They crossed the yard under a sky thick with stars, the prairie breeze carrying the faint scent of rain from far away. At the kitchen door, Caleb paused. "Mrs. McKenna." He stopped, corrected himself. "Lila." Her name sounded different on his tongue, careful, deliberate. "I'm glad you're here," he said. "We all are." She looked up at him. This quiet man who had offered her work instead of pity, respect instead of charity. "I think," she said softly, "I'm beginning to be glad too." For the first time since she had met him, his face broke into a full smile. It transformed him, stripping away the reserve he wore like armor. "Good," he said simply. "That's good." When she stepped back into the kitchen, she caught herself thinking of it as hers now. Her kitchen. The thought startled her. Belonging was too strong a word, but possibility it was there, settling in like roots pushing into new soil. She thought of Nate, of the life they had dreamed of the children they never had. That future lay in Everton County soil, gone beyond reaching. But here, with earth under her nails, and Caleb's smile still warming her memory. She wondered if another kind of future might take hold, not a replacement for what had been lost. Something new, something that could grow in prairie ground if given care. Tomorrow there would be more meals, more work, the steady beat of labor that kept people alive in a hard land. But for the first time in half a year, it did not feel like mere survival. It felt like the beginning of something else entirely. In the weeks that followed, life at Stone Creek Ranch settled into a steady cadence that matched the land itself. Lila rose in the dark while the stars still burned cold, learned the mood of the old iron stove, and came to feel the dough shift under her palms when it was ready for the oven. She judged coffee by scent alone, strong enough to put backbone into a tired hand before sunup. The work was hard in a way she had never known back in Everton County, but it fit her like a new pair of gloves that already knew the shape of her fingers. Empty plates returned to her counter, and the men said their thanks without prompting. The color came back to her cheeks. The tremor that used to live in her hands when hunger had the upper hand faded away. The sun browned her skin despite her bonnet. Calluses toughened where soft merchant wife skin used to be. The woman she had been became a memory at the edge of her mind, while the one she was becoming grew clearer each morning. She coaxed heat from ash and turned flour and water into something that made a long day easier to bear. It was a Tuesday when the air wavered with late spring heat and the prairie looked as if it were breathing. Lila had her forearms ghost pale with flour, working bread on the long table, when the doorway burst open. "Mrs. McKenna, come quick." Caleb's horse pitched him. Toby Finch stood there wide-eyed, freckles standing out against his dust. Lila wiped her hands once on her apron and ran, her heart hammering a hard rhythm she could feel in her throat. They cut across the yard to the corral where a knot of men had gathered. She shouldered her way through the ring of bodies. Caleb sat propped against the fence rail, jaw tight, his left arm clamped to his chest. His tan had leached to a grayish color around the mouth. The sight of him upright, conscious and breathing, flooded her with relief so fierce she had to steady herself on the rail. "Green colt with too much spirit," he said through clenched teeth. "We had a difference of opinion." Even from where she stood, she could see the angle of his shoulder was wrong. Pain tugged the corners of his eyes. Yeah. She dropped to a knee without thinking and set her hands gently where they needed to be. "It is out," she said, the calm in her voice surprising even herself. "It needs to be set." Amos Stone pushed through the men, face as tight as rawhide. "Dr. Pike is in town," he said. "Half a day there and back." "I can manage," Lila said, before she could doubt it. "It will hurt." Caleb looked at her, and in that look was trust that stole her breath. "Do it." She sent Toby flying for a bottle and clean cloth. While he ran, she eased behind Caleb, set her boots, and wrapped the cloth around his forearm for grip. She closed her eyes for a heartbeat and called up the lessons her father had taught her back in Maple Crossing long before drink took his skill and his name. When Toby skidded back, she nodded once. "On 3, she told Caleb, voice low so only he could hear. 1, 2. She pulled and rotated in one clean motion on 2, not 3. The joint slid home with a muffled pop that turned the world sharp for an instant. Caleb's whole body went iron hard, a strangled sound escaping him. Then the rigid line of his shoulders eased. Color crept back to his face by degrees. "Sweet mercy," Jed Turner breathed. "Where did you learn that?" "Ma'am, my father," Lila said simply, already fashioning a sling from the cloth. "Keep it still a few days. No proving how tough you are." Caleb tried for a smile that did not quite make it. Never intended to prove anything, he muttered, then reached with his good hand and caught hers for the briefest moment. Thank you. The warmth of his fingers traveled up her arm like a spark that found tinder. She stood too quickly and brushed dust from her skirt to hide the rush in her face. You should rest, she told him. Toby, walk him in. I can get there, Caleb said, stubborn as any man worth the name. And he did, step by careful step. Lila a half step behind, in case his pride faltered before his strength. That evening she carried a tray to the narrow room off the front hall, where Caleb had been set up to sleep until his shoulders stopped arguing. The room held a bed, a washstand, and a short shelf of well-read books. The window let in the last wash of light. Caleb sat propped against pillows, trying to cut meat with one hand and losing the argument. Let me, Lila said, taking the plate before he could protest. I am not an invalid. No, you are a bull-headed man who will tear what we just fixed if you are not careful. She cut neat bites and set the fork where he could manage. There, now you can feed yourself and keep whatever pride you have left. His laugh came out surprised, and the sound pulled at something in her chest. You sound like Ma, he said. She had no patience for foolish pride, especially in men. A wise woman, Lila said, and pulled the chair closer to the bed. Tell me about her. So he did. The evening tilted toward night as he talked. Eleanor Stone had come from Cedarvale with a head full of ideas about what a school should be, and instead she had married Amos Stone and built a home where the wind never stopped and the sky ran on forever. She insisted on hot meals even when cattle ran and men forgot what day it was. Civilization starts at the supper table, she would say. She taught the boys their letters and made them practice penmanship until their hands cramped. Did you thank her for it? Lila asked. Every day, Caleb said. And then his gaze went to the window. I only wish I had told her more of it while she was still here to hear it. They sat quiet a moment as the light thinned into blue. Lila studied him without meaning to. The sun lines at the corners of his eyes, the square set of his jaw, the unruly way his hair fell when it grew past a certain length. He was not the polished kind of handsome that belonged behind shop counters. He was handsome in the way of the open country, all use and wind and grit. You are staring, he said softly, amusement touching his voice. I was thinking you could use a haircut, she said, the heat that rose in her face betraying her. That. So are you asking me to prove it, Mr. Stone? If you are offering, Miss McKenna, I will not say no. Cannot have the foreman looking like a wild man at the table. He shifted, and the move reminded his shoulder of itself. He hissed, then let the breath go slow. Lila, can I ask you something? She nodded. Her pulse beat a little quicker at the care in his tone. Your husband. Do you miss him? The question sat with them, solid as a chair. Lila took her time before answering, because some words carry weight and ought to be set down right. I miss who we were together, she said. The way the house sounded when he came in, the shape the future seemed to take when we talked it over. She drew another breath. But the sharp of it is not as sharp as it was. Sometimes that makes me feel like I'm doing wrong by his memory. Caleb's voice gentled. Ma used to say grief is like a fire on the grass. At first it takes everything in its path. Later, if you give it time, new green pushes through the ash. It does not mean what burned did not matter. It means life keeps going. Your mother kept a whole storehouse of wisdom, Lila said. She was full of something. Caleb answered with a small smile. Pa called it Irish stubbornness. Did you get any of that? Lila asked. "Why do you think I climbed on a colt with more vinegar than sense?" he said. And the laugh that followed this time was easy and real. The sound changed his face again, younger for a breath, and she felt her own smile answering before she could think to stop it. His good hand moved over the blanket toward where her fingers rested on the chair arm. He stopped short, as if some quiet rule had stepped between them and reminded him of its shape. The gap between their hands felt as bright as a line in full sun. She pretended not to notice and reached for the water glass instead. "Drink," she said, "then try to sleep. Pain is a hard rider when a man is tired." "Yes, ma'am," he answered, humor still in his eyes. She stood to take the plate, and he caught her sleeve lightly with his uninjured hand. "Lila." "Thank you. Not just for the shoulder." "You are welcome," she said. "Good night. Caleb." She stepped into the hall and stood for a moment with her back against the cool wall, letting her breath even out. The house was quiet. The bunkhouse sent a low hum of voices toward the porch. Out beyond the yard a coyote called. She carried the tray to the kitchen, set the plate in the basin, and banked the stove for the night. Before she blew the lamp, she went to her room and lifted the small jar from the sill. The prairie flowers had bent their heads, but they still held a pale kind of courage. She set them beside her ring on the washstand and thought of Eleanor Stone saying civilization starts at the supper table. She thought of the men around that long board with their hats off and their talk easy. She thought of Caleb, pale with pain and still making space for her answer when he asked about Nate. The ache in her chest was different now, not gone, changed. She lay down and watched a square of starlight move across the ceiling as the night turned. Tomorrow would ask a lot. She would answer. Lila stood by the doorway of Caleb's room, a tray balanced in her hands, when he said her name in a low voice. "Lila." A Toby Finch called up from the hall before the words could land. "Sorry to trouble you, but Roy is asking about second helpings, and Gus told me to fetch an answer." "I will be right there," Lila called back. She set the cup on the stand and stood in a single smooth motion. "You need to rest," she told Caleb. "I will send Toby up if you want anything else." She did not wait for his reply. The hall felt cooler than the small room, and the kitchen felt cooler still. She pressed her palms against the scrubbed table and took a long breath. It was foolish to let her heart race like that. She was a widow and a hired cook with no room for foolishness. The Stones had given her a place and a wage. Caleb was a good man who deserved better than a woman who still kept a ring close as a talisman against the dark. Yet the memory of the way he said her name would not be pushed off. There had been respect in it, not distance. Care, not pity. "Mrs. McKenna," Toby said from the doorway, his freckles bright with curiosity. "Everything all right? Everything is fine," she said briskly, turning back to the stove. "Tell Roy he can have seconds if he splits tomorrow's kindling." The boy grinned and darted away as if she had handed him a holiday. The next days passed with Caleb kept to light duty. He bore it poorly at first, like any man who was used to sitting a saddle from sunup. Lila watched his patience return in fits and starts. By the end of the week, he climbed back on a horse. He rode careful and favored his right side. But he rode, and the set of his shoulders looked right again. Sunday came with a quiet the ranch did not often know. Most of the hands had gone to town, and Amos had ridden to a neighbor's place to talk water and fence. Lila had her sleeves rolled as she bent over the kitchen garden she was coaxing back to life. The earth gave under her fingers, warm and rich. She had found old rows under the weeds, neat lines someone had loved. She was working a stubborn root free when she heard hoofbeats on packed earth. Caleb walked into the yard leading 2 saddled horses. "I thought you might like to see more of the place," he said. She looked at the dirt under her nails and the dust on her apron. "I am hardly dressed for riding." "You are dressed fine. Come on." "Lila, the work will wait." There was something in his voice that was not quite a plea, but it was close. She untied her apron and hung it on a nail. She had not been on a horse since she left Everton County, but when he brought the gentle mare up, her body remembered what to do. Caleb steadied her with a hand at her elbow, and they set out at an easy walk. They rode for a while without talking, the prairie opening wider with every step. Caleb pointed with his chin when he did speak. "Willow Creek marks our eastern line. There is a stand of cottonwoods there where we push cattle in bad weather." He pointed again. "That knoll catches the last light. Ma would send us up there when storms came. Easier to read the sky from that rise." They turned toward a hill that rose soft out of the grass. 3 simple crosses stood near the top, bleached by wind and sun. Wildflowers had taken hold between them. He swung down, and she did the same. "We come up here when we need reminding of what matters," he said. He stood with his hat in his hands for a long breath. "She would have liked what you have done in the house. Feels like life again." "It is only cooking," Lila said, not sure where to put her eyes. "It is more than cooking," he answered, looking at her full on. "You have given the place back its heart. The men feel it. Pa feels it." He stopped then, his jaw working as if he had come up against a fence he had not planned on. Daniel in the original text used an unfinished I. "We can have Caleb gather himself. I do not have any claim to ask you for anything," he said at last. "You are still grieving, and so am I. I only need to say this. Seeing you move through that kitchen, hearing you laugh with Toby, watching you settle Daisy like you were born to it, that is the first time this ranch has felt like home since Ma died. You are not just the cook to me, Lila. You are becoming everything." The words lay between them in the clean air, raw and honest. Tears pricked behind her eyes before she could stop them. "I do not know if I am ready," she said. "I am not asking for a promise," he answered quickly. "I only wanted you to know the truth." She stepped closer, up close. She could see the gold flecks in his green eyes and the hope that lived there beside a measure of fear. Her hand rose without her permission and touched his cheek. "I am afraid," she whispered. "So am I," he said. He covered her hand with his good one, warm and calloused. "Maybe it is all right to be afraid. Maybe being afraid together is better than being brave alone." Nate came to her then, not with the knife of guilt that used to follow him, but with the steadiness of the man who had always wished her well. "Be happy, Lila. That is what I wanted for you." The thought did not hurt. It set something right. "Maybe," she said aloud. They rode back as the sun slid down, and the light turned sweet and long. They did not touch. They did not need to. The air between them hummed like a wire drawn tight. At the porch, he reached up to help her down. His hand settled at her waist a moment longer than they had to. "Thank you," she said, "for the ride, for showing me the places that hold your people." "Always," he said, and the word sounded like a pledge he had not meant to speak. That night in her small room, Lila unpinned her hair and set the brush aside. For the first time since Nate had slipped the ring on her finger in Riverbend, she drew it off and lifted it to the lamplight. It had been everything once. In her palm, it looked both small and steady. She did not put it away. Not yet. She set it on the washstand instead of wearing it to bed. A small change, but small changes can root like prairie flowers after fire. Morning brought a bite in the air that spoke of autumn coming in earnest. Lila drew her shawl close and crossed the yard from the hen house with a basket of warm eggs. The grass had turned a deeper gold, the same color the sunrise laid over the eastern rim of the world. "Festival starts Saturday," Toby announced at breakfast. He bounced on the bench hard enough to rattle the cups. "There will be dancing and a pie contest and maybe even a fiddler's circle if Mr. Whitcomb brings his cousin." "Steady yourself before you wear your plate," Jed Turner said. But there was a hint of a smile in the lines at the corners of his eyes. "You sound like you are 10. "Let him be excited," Lila said as she poured coffee. "We have not had much to fuss over. When is the last time any of you had a reason to celebrate?" The men shifted and looked at one another. 2 years since Eleanor Stone passed. Someone said, and the room seemed to remember that all at once. For 2 years the ranch had kept its head down and its grief tucked where a man puts things he cannot carry if he looks at them too long. In recent months the air had lightened. She could feel it, as if windows had been opened and the house could breathe again. "Mrs. McKenna is right," Amos said from the head of the table. "Time we quit living like we are under a black cloth. Eleanor would not want that." He looked at his son. "Caleb, you will escort Mrs. McKenna to the festival." It was not a question. Caleb nodded once, color rising along his cheekbones. "If she is willing." All eyes turned to Lila. She felt her face grow warm, but kept her voice even. "I suppose I could use a few things from town," she said. "Baking powder, cloth, maybe some new dish towels if Agnes Mallory has any left in her cupboard." Toby whooped and caught himself too late. Jed gave him the look again, and he sank back into his seat with a grin he could not hide. The mood at the table lifted like a curtain drawn back to let the light in. After breakfast, the men drifted to their work, and Lila stood a quiet moment with her hands wrapped around a warm cup. The idea of a festival in town seemed to stretch beyond what the last year had allowed. Lanterns strung along a dusty street, music finding its own way under the stars, women in good dresses and men in their best shirts. Gossip would come easy. She knew. The widow from Everton County riding in with the Stones. Some would approve, some would not. She could not make her choices by the shape of other people's mouths. She rinsed the cup and set it to dry. Then she made her list again on a clean scrap. Flour, because a house is not a house without it. Lard, because winter always asks for more. Baking powder, because biscuits should lift. Pepper, because the men like the bite. She added sugar if the price was fair, and a length of blue ribbon if her courage allowed it. The day pulled her back into its work. Bread to start. A stew that could sit at the back of the stove through the afternoon. Apples that wanted peeling so they would not go to waste. She moved through it all with a steadiness she did not have when she first came. Outside, the wind pushed the cottonwoods into a low talk. The bunkhouse sent up the rhythm of men at chores. By late afternoon, she had pies cooling on the sill and biscuits ready to cut. She checked the coffee tin again and tucked the list in her pocket, so she would not forget it when Saturday came. She stepped out to the porch for a breath and looked at the sky. It had the high, clear look that means a cool night and a bright next day. When she went back in, the kitchen felt like a place that knew her name, not just because the men said it with thanks at the table, because the room itself had learned the measure of her stride and the set of her hands. She glanced at the washstand in her little room and saw the ring resting beside the small jar where the last of the prairie flowers bowed their heads. She was not ready to put the ring away for good. She was ready to carry it different, Saturday would come soon enough with music and light and the chance to step onto a floor with Caleb's hand in hers. For now there was supper to serve and a house to keep, and the steady knowledge that something new had begun and would keep on if she tended it with the same care she gave to bread, to coffee, and to the quiet hope that had taken root in her heart. It wasn't a request. It was Amos Stone giving his word as final as iron. Caleb's ears turned red, but he nodded once. "If she's willing," he said. All eyes slid toward Lila. Heat rose up her neck, but she managed to keep her voice steady. "I suppose I could use a few supplies from town." Toby Finch let out a whoop, earning himself a sharp look from Jed Turner, though even Jed's lined face carried a ghost of a smile. The decision had been made, and like a summer storm rolling in over the prairie, anticipation charged the air around that table. The days that followed carried a new kind of energy through Stone Creek Ranch. Men debated which horses to ride into town, which of them might try their luck in the roping contest, whether Gus Malloy's notorious corn liquor would make its appearance again. Even the newer hands, Boone Mercer with his scar, Roy Calder with his constant measuring eyes, and the quiet one, Luke Harlan, seemed caught up in the talk. Lila tried to keep her head down, yet she could not deny a ripple of excitement. It had been more than a year since she had stood among a gathering with music and laughter, and never before had she gone as a woman untethered. Or perhaps tethered differently. Everyone knew she kept Stone Creek's kitchen now, and everyone, she suspected, had their own thoughts about her connection to Amos's son. On the night before the festival, she stood before her narrow mirror with her 2 plain wool dresses laid across the bed. They were sturdy things, dark and somber, fit for a merchant's wife who had worn mourning like a second skin. Neither seemed right for a harvest festival. Neither seemed right for the way Caleb's eyes lingered when he thought she wasn't looking. A knock at the door startled her. When she opened it, she found Amos Stone himself standing there with a small wooden box in his hands. "This was Eleanor's," he said gruffly, as though the words had cost him something. "Been sitting in a trunk doing no good. She'd want it worn." Inside lay a dress of deep blue cotton, scattered with tiny white flowers. Simple but fine. Beneath it rested a pair of soft kid gloves and 2 ribbons the color of cornflowers. "Mr. Stone, I couldn't—" "You can, and you will," Amos said, his tone leaving no room for refusal. But his eyes, so often stern, carried a softness that made her throat tighten. "My boy's been lighter these past months than he's been since we buried his mama. That's because of you. Eleanor would want you to have something decent." Lila managed a quiet thank you. Though her voice caught, Amos paused at the doorway. His hand braced on the frame. Caleb's a careful man. He's been hurt before, though he won't speak on it. Don't let him use that caution as a wall. Then he tipped his hat and left her with the box. She lifted the dress against herself. Eleanor Stone had been close to her own size. It would fit. The thought of wearing a dead woman's dress might have unsettled another, but to Lila it felt like a blessing, like a welcome. Saturday dawned sharp and bright, the prairie air carrying a promise of change. The hands left early for town, riding or piling into the supply wagon. Lila rose before the rooster to prepare her offerings for the communal meal: 2 pies, a batch of golden biscuits, and a jar of plum. Preserves she had boiled down from fruit near Willow Creek. When she stepped out of her room in Eleanor's blue dress, her hair pinned up with the ribbons, Caleb was already waiting by the buggy. He turned at the sound of her steps and froze. "You look—" His throat worked. "You look beautiful." The words warmed her more than the shawl over her shoulders. Your mother had fine taste. Pa gave you her dress." She nodded, and something eased in his face. She'd be glad. She always said pretty things ought to be worn, not hidden in trunks. He offered his hand and helped her into the buggy with care that made her chest ache. The ride to town was quiet at first, both of them keenly aware of the step they were taking. At last Caleb spoke. "I should warn you folks will talk about you being there with me. Let them talk." She answered without hesitation. His glance was sharp, then softened into something deeper. You sure she thought about gossip and whispers? About women at Mallory's boarding house who lived for other folks' stories? Then she thought about Toby's laughter, Jed's quiet nods of approval, and the way Caleb's smile had slowly unthawed her heart. I'm sure. Town had remade itself for the festival. Lanterns hung from posts and rafters, though they would not glow until evening. Tables stretched down Main Street, sagging with pies, roasted meats, and jars of preserves. The sound of fiddle music drifted from the cleared space near Whitcomb's general store that had been swept clean for dancing. Children darted between grown-up legs, their laughter ringing like bells. As Lila stepped down from the buggy, she felt eyes upon her. Whispers traveled as quick as prairie wind. The widow from Everton County with Caleb Stone. That's her, the one who offered her ring for bread. Heard she can cook like no one's business. She heard judgment in some voices, curiosity in others, yet there were nods of welcome too. Agnes Mallory spotted her first and bustled over, her skirt swishing like a sail in wind. "Don't you look lovely? Dear, and those pies, why the smell alone could win the contest. You must give me your crust recipe." She lowered her voice with a wink. "Pay no mind to the whisperers. Half of them would swap places with you if they could." The hours spun by in a rush. Lila found herself pressed into judging the pie contest, choosing with care to hand first prize to the minister's wife. She watched Caleb compete in the roping, his movements easy and sure, taking second place to a wiry rider from the Double Bar Ranch. She shook hands with what felt like half the county, each introduction blurring into the next. By the time the sun dipped low, lanterns were lit, their glow soft and golden against the dusk. Fiddle strings set a brisk rhythm, and couples spun across the packed earth floor. Lila stood at the edge, watching the swirl of skirts and the laughter rising on the cool air. Once, she had loved dancing, back when Nate was alive, back when the future stretched clear as the road before her. A voice broke into her thoughts. "May I have this dance?" Caleb stood before her, his work jacket gone, his white shirt gleaming in the lamplight. He held out his hand, not presuming, only asking. Her breath caught, but her hand rose, slipping into his. Lila hesitated for only a moment before sliding her hand into Caleb's. The warmth of his palm traveled through her, steadying her, even as it set her heart racing. He led her toward the square where lantern light shimmered and fiddles sang. The musicians shifted from a lively reel to a waltz, slower and richer. Caleb's hand rested at her waist, careful, proper, yet every point of contact felt alive. She drew in a breath and let him guide her into the rhythm. "I ought to warn you," he said with a crooked smile. "I've never been much of a dancer." "You're doing fine," she replied, her voice softer than she meant it to be. And he was. He moved with the same quiet competence he brought to every task, sure-footed and steady. "Where'd you learn?" she asked. Ma insisted. Said a man who couldn't dance wasn't fit to call himself civilized. His thumb brushed her palm, almost by accident, but the touch lingered in her awareness, Haven't had much cause to practice lately." The music swelled, and she let herself fall into the cadence of it, her body remembering something her heart had thought lost. Other couples spun around them, but in that moment she saw only him. His green eyes locked to hers, unflinching. "Lila," he said, his voice low enough that she had to lean closer to hear. Her chest tightened. Yes, he turned her in a gentle spin, buying himself a breath. When she returned to his arms, he spoke again. "I was engaged once, years back." Her steps faltered, but his arm steadied her. Her name was Catherine, daughter of a rancher up north. Beautiful, sharp-witted, everything a man was supposed to want. We had plans, a wedding date set. But then she came here, saw the hard work, the distance from town, the way winters can strip a body down to nothing. She said she couldn't bury herself in the wilderness, not even for love. She left the next morning. Lila's throat tightened. She knew what it was to be abandoned by circumstances beyond control. Caleb's jaw worked. "I'm telling you this because I need you to know what I feel for you. It isn't about loneliness or convenience. When you're in that kitchen humming while you cook, when you stand tall against Boone Mercer's smirks, when you kneel to milk Daisy like you were born to it, you're not just surviving here. You're bringing this place back to life. You're bringing me back to life." The waltz had ended, but they hadn't stopped moving, caught in the pull of words stronger than music. Lila raised her hand to his cheek. The stubble scratched her palm, grounding her. "I'm not Catherine." "No," he said fiercely, covering her hand with his. "You're Lila, and that's everything." A throat cleared beside them. Toby Finch stood grinning ear to ear. "They're starting another dance if you two are finished staring at each other." Caleb flushed, but Lila laughed bright, unguarded. The kind of laugh she hadn't known she still had in her. "One more," she told Caleb. "Then I should check on those pies." One dance became two, then three. They spoke between songs about Eleanor's roses that Lila was coaxing back in the yard, about the books lining Caleb's shelf, about memories that came easier in the glow of lanterns. She felt lighter with every step, as though some invisible weight had slipped from her shoulders. The festival wound down slowly, the crowd thinning as families gathered children and loaded wagons. Lila was helping pack leftovers when raised voices cut through the music. She glanced up to see Boone Mercer and Roy Calder squared off with ranch hands from another spread. Both newcomers reeked of whiskey, their stances loose but dangerous. "Said you were cheatin'," Boone slurred. Hand twitching near his hip, Caleb was there in an instant, planting himself between the groups. "Problem here." "No problem," Boone drawled, but his eyes glittered with malice. "Just explaining how things work." "The only thing you're explaining is how to get yourself fired," Caleb said evenly. "Walk it off. Now, for a breath." The air hung heavy with the threat of violence. Then Roy grabbed Boone's arm, muttering about not being worth it, and dragged him away. Caleb's body remained coiled, ready, long after the men had gone. "Trouble?" Lila asked, appearing at his side, her voice pitched low. "Could be." He shook his head, eyes following the retreating figures. "Pa hired them, and we need hands, but I don't trust 'em. I'll talk to 'em." Then he forced a lighter tone. "Tonight's not for worry." He was right. The festival ended with laughter and lanterns, with neighbors promising visits, with Toby still glowing from too much pie. For Lila, it had been more than an outing. It had been proof that joy could exist again. The buggy ride home was quiet, but not empty. Silence stretched between them like a quilt, warm and shared. When they reached Stone Creek, Caleb helped her down, his hand steadying her longer than necessary. "Thank you," she said softly, "for the dancing, for telling me about Catherine, for everything. Lila." His voice wrapped around her name like prayer. "Can I?" "Yes." His lips touched hers, gentle at first, as if afraid she might vanish. She leaned into him, her hands finding his shoulders, and for the first time in over a year the ice in her chest cracked. When they parted, both were unsteady, breaths mingling in the night air. "I'll court you proper," Caleb promised. "Whatever you need, however long it takes." "All I need," she whispered, "is you being yourself. Later, alone in her room." Lila unpinned her hair and folded Eleanor's blue dress carefully. Her gaze fell on her wedding ring lying on the washstand. She picked it up, the gold-catching lamplight, then placed it in the drawer, not discarded, not forgotten, but set aside. She was ready to face whatever future came. 3 days later, trouble showed itself. Lila was hanging laundry when she noticed riders on the horizon. Not the purposeful trot of men working cattle, but a lazy circling, like buzzards watching prey. She shaded her eyes, counting 5, maybe 6. They moved along the eastern boundary of Stone Creek. That evening, Caleb came in from the range, his expression grim. "Someone cut the fence lines. We lost near 20 head before we caught it," Rustler's Amos asked, sitting stiff at the head of the table. "Maybe," Caleb said, "or maybe someone wants us to think so." His gaze slid, almost involuntarily, toward Boone and Roy where they sat with the other hands. The newcomers ate in silence, but Lila saw the suspicion simmering in Caleb's eyes, the way his hand tightened around his cup, and in that moment, she knew the peace of the festival was already behind them, and the harder days of testing lay ahead. Boone Mercer caught Caleb's sharp look and answered it with a slow, mocking grin before lowering his head to his plate. Lila's stomach nodded. The meal went on, but the tension hung heavy in the air, like thunderclouds gathering over the plains. In the days that followed, the unease deepened. First, it was another stretch of fence wire clipped clean, the cattle scattered in confusion. Then someone dumped a dead coyote into one of the stock ponds, fouling the water so badly the men had to drain it. Each act seemed meant less to cause real damage and more to keep everyone on edge, running in circles, watching the horizon for threats that never fully came. By the time evening fell, tempers were short and eyes sharper than ever. "It's Silas Grant," Jed Turner muttered one night, his voice carrying the weight of certainty. The regular hands had gathered in the kitchen, waiting until Boone, Roy, and Luke drifted out to the bunkhouse before speaking their minds. "Has to be. Man's been eyeing this place for years." Caleb sat stiff-backed at the table, fingers drumming against his coffee cup. "I can't prove it. And we can't fight shadows." Lila quietly poured refills, listening more than speaking. She knew enough about Silas Grant's double-bar spread to understand why the men were uneasy. His ranch was 3 times the size of Stone Creek, built on intimidation and a willingness to cut corners or throats to get what he wanted. Stories floated through town of mysterious fires and neighbors run off their land with little more than the clothes on their backs. "Maybe that's the point," she said suddenly, surprising even herself. Every head turned toward her. "In my husband's store, back in Everton County, we had a competitor who played the same kind of game. Small thefts, spoiled shipments, whispers to customers that our goods weren't reliable. We spent so much time fixing small problems we didn't see the real one coming." "What was it?" Caleb asked, leaning forward. "He was buying our mortgage note. By the time we realized it, he nearly owned us." I'm wondering what Grant really wants here. Cattle fences. Her eyes met Amos's across the table. Or the water. The room fell still. Stone Creek Ranch sat atop the most reliable source in the valley, Willow Creek, winding down from the mountains, steady even in drought. Without it, the ranch would shrivel in a season. Amos's face went grim. Grant's wanted those rights since the first day I drove a post into this ground. Then that's what he'll come for, Lila said quietly. Later. Caleb walked her to her room, as he often did now. Those moments in the hush of the house had become a rhythm of their own soft words under starlight. A brush of fingers when he handed her a plate, fleeting kisses stolen in shadows. The propriety of it only made the sweetness sharper. "You're clever," he murmured, taking her hand as they paused by her door. "Seeing what the rest of us missed." "I've had practice spotting snakes," she said wryly. "Sometimes they wear boots and hats instead of business suits, but they're no less dangerous." He pulled her close, his breath warm against her hair. "I worry," he admitted, voice unsteady. "If Grant makes a move, we'll face it," she said, stronger than she felt. His arms tightened. "I love you, Lila." Her breath caught. She pulled back to see his face, finding both fear and hope in the shadows of his eyes. "I love you too," she whispered. The words felt like setting down a burden she hadn't known she was carrying. His face broke into wonder, and she thought she'd never seen him so alive. They might have stood there forever, if not for the pounding of hooves outside. Caleb's hand went instantly to the revolver at his hip as a rider thundered into the yard. A moment later, young Pete, one of the newer hands, skidded to the porch, breathless. Boss trouble at Willow Creek Riders. 12, at least. "Jed sent me for you." Caleb was already moving, shoving his arm into his coat. "Wake the others. Quiet. Get 'em saddled." He turned to Lila. "Go to the root cellar. Bar the door. I can help, please. Just one word." But it carried such weight she could only nod. He kissed her, quick and fierce. "Promise me you'll stay safe. Promise me you'll come back. Always." Then he was gone, swallowed by the night. For a heartbeat, Lila stood frozen. Then instinct drove her. She darted to the kitchen, yanked the rifle Amos kept behind the door, checked the load. The root cellar would hide her, but blind her, too. Instead, she darkened the house, leaving one lamp low to peer out. From the window, she caught glimpses of riders ghosting into the night. Stone men answering Caleb's call. She watched Boone and his crew dragging their feet, taking far too long to mount up. Her gut clenched. The waiting was torment. Every creak of the house, every rattle of wind against shutters made her pulse leap. She remembered the fever that had taken Thomas, how helpless she'd been then. But this was different. If trouble came, she could fight. Then gunfire cracked the silence. Not one shot, but many. Bursts of light flickered near the creek. Men shouted. Their voices carried on the night air. The sounds rolled like thunder over the prairie. Lila gripped the rifle tighter, knuckles white, praying with every breath. The door banged open. She spun, finger on the trigger. Toby. She nearly wept in relief at the sight of the boy. His face was pale, a bloody gash marking his forehead. "Mrs. McKenna," he panted. "Caleb sent me, he's hurt." But his words cut short as Boone Mercer stepped into the kitchen behind him, shoving the boy aside like a rag doll. Boone's shirt was spotless, his face free of sweat or dirt. He hadn't been near the fight. His smile was cold as a January wind. "Well now," he drawled, "seems a shame to let all this ruckus go to waste." Lila leveled the rifle square at his chest. "Get out. Don't think so." His gaze swept the kitchen, then slid back to her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Mr. Grant pays well for news about this place. When the men eat, when the herd moves, where the weak spots are." His eyes traveled over her insultingly. "Didn't expect a bonus like you. Though? I said get out." Her voice held steady, though her heart thudded like a hammer. Boone took a step closer, sneer curling his lip. "One woman with a gun. She probably doesn't know how to fire. Where's your protector now, right here?" The words cut through the room like steel. Caleb filled the doorway, his left arm limp at his side, blood staining his shirt, but his right hand held his revolver steady, its barrel aimed between Boone Mercer's eyes. "You should have stayed bought," Caleb said, his voice flat as iron. For the first time that night, Boone's smirk faltered. Caleb's voice was colder than a winter gale. "You should have chosen your employer more carefully." His revolver never wavered. "Drop the gun." Slow. For a moment, everything in the kitchen teetered on a knife's edge. Boone Mercer's smirk deepened, his hand twitching toward his holster. The crack of gunfire shattered the stillness. 2 shots rang out almost together. Boone jerked backward, a cry ripping from his throat as the bullet tore through his shoulder. His revolver clattered across the floor. Caleb staggered against the doorframe, breath hissing through his teeth, but his own shot had found its mark. "Anyone else," Caleb demanded, his voice rough but steady as he swept the doorway with his revolver. A figure stepped out of the shadows with both hands raised. Roy Calder. His face was pale, his words quick. "Not me. I'm done." Luke rode off soon as the first shot rang out. Boone was the only one taking Grant's coin. "Then ride," Caleb said, "and don't stop till you're across Colorado." Roy wasted no time. He heaved Boone to his feet, ignoring the man's curses, and half-dragged him into the night. The moment they were gone, Caleb's strength broke. His revolver slipped from numb fingers as his knees buckled. Lila dropped the rifle and caught him before he hit the floor. Blood soaked through his shirt, staining her hands as she pressed against the wound high on his chest. His face was gray, lips pinched tight. "Don't you dare," she said fiercely, her hands working without hesitation. "You promised me you'd come back." A faint smile flickered across his mouth. "I did come back." His eyes fluttered. "Others still coming." "Hush," she snapped, reaching for the towels she'd kept near the stove. "Save your strength." "Toby," she shouted. The boy scrambled to her side, his forehead still streaked with dried blood. "Boil water, as fast as you can." The door banged open again, but this time it was Amos Stone. He took one look at his son on the floor and swore low. "How bad bullets still in there," Lila said, her father's teachings guiding her words. "High in the chest, missed the lung, but he's losing blood." More men crowded in Jed Turner, young Pete, others she recognized. They bore torn shirts, bruises, and powder burns, but they were alive. "Riders are falling back," Jed reported. "Grant didn't count on us being ready, and word's gone out. Neighboring ranches are already sending men." "Good," Amos said grimly, "but we'll need a doctor." "Hours before Ezra Pike can ride out here," Jed muttered. "Then we hold him together until he gets here," Lila said. She pressed harder against the wound. "Caleb, talk to me. Stay awake." His eyes flickered open, dazed but stubborn. "Always bossy," he murmured, his lips quirking despite the pain. "Always like that. About you." Her heart twisted. "Then you'll love being married to me." The words slipped free before she could think. His gaze sharpened. Even with fever rising and blood seeping fast, he caught every word. That, a proposal. She gave him a trembling smile. Maybe you'll have to live to find out. Motivation. He breathed and clung to her hand. The night bled into dawn. Lila worked without pause, binding wounds, cooling his skin when fever threatened, whispering prayers when his breathing turned shallow. When Dr. Ezra Pike finally arrived, he looked at her work and gave a nod of respect. "You kept him alive till I could get here," he said. "Not many could have done that." The bullet came out before noon. The doctor stitched and dressed the wound, warning that recovery would be long and hard. Lila never left Caleb's side. When fever came, she fought it. When it broke, she bathed his face with cool water, whispering comfort into his ear. At last, his eyes opened clear and bright, focusing on her. "Stubborn woman," he rasped. "Don't you have a kitchen to run?" "The kitchen can wait," she said softly, brushing his damp hair back. "Did you mean it?" His voice held no jest now. "About marrying?" She bent closer, kissing his forehead gently. "Which one of us proposed to the other?" He chuckled weakly, then winced. "Yes, Lila. If you'll have a half-ruined rancher with more pride than sense." Her lips touched his, soft as spring rain. Yes, Caleb Stone, to everything. Outside, Stone Creek Ranch stirred back to life. Men called to one another. Cattle lowed in the distance, and the eternal wind swept across the grasslands. They had survived another storm, but the prairie rarely allowed peace for long. 2 weeks later, before dawn had fully touched the sky, thunder shook the valley not from the heavens, but from hooves pounding against hard earth. Lila jerked awake, already reaching for the Colt revolver Caleb had pressed into her hand days earlier. From the yard came Toby's shout, high and terrified. "Grant's men. They're coming from the north." Lila dressed in seconds, steady even as her heart hammered. She threw her shawl around her shoulders, grabbed the rifle and a box of cartridges, and ran for the kitchen windows where she could see the approach. Out across the prairie, riders streamed like dark water, their rifles flashing in the half-light. Twice as many as before. At least 20 hired guns Silas Grant had scraped together, determined to finish what he'd started. Caleb was already in the kitchen, bandages still wrapping his chest, but his eyes sharp with fire. He checked his Winchester with practiced speed. "I told you to stay in your room," he said, not looking at her. "And I told you I'm not the hiding kind," she replied, sliding into position at the opposite window. He gave her a quick glance, pride glinting behind the worry. "How many 20? Maybe more. Pa's got men at the barn and the bunkhouse," Caleb muttered. His jaw tightened. "This isn't a raid, it's war." As if to prove his words, a bullet shattered the glass inches from Lila's head, spraying shards across the floorboards. She ducked, heart pounding, then rose carefully and returned fire. Her shot flew wide, but forced 2 riders to veer off. "Where did a merchant's wife learn to shoot?" Caleb asked, almost in disbelief. "My father insisted," she said, levering another round. "Told me a woman alone should always know how to defend herself, though I never thought it had come to this." Outside, the battle roared to life. Gunfire cracked from every side as Grant's men tried to close in. From the barn, Jed and the others fired back steadily. Amos's voice rang out like a bell, calling orders through the chaos. The air filled with smoke and shouts, the scent of powder drifting through the open windows. This wasn't just a test anymore. Grant had come to take Stone Creek Ranch once and for all, but Lila McKenna had no intention of letting it go. The fighting at Stone Creek Ranch grew fiercer with every passing heartbeat. Caleb fired through the shattered window, jaw clenched tight, his body straining against wounds not yet healed. Lila crouched at the next window, her rifle balanced steady despite the tremor in her hands. They both knew the truth: the defenders were badly outnumbered. Riders surged across the prairie like locusts, trying to circle the ranch house, some already veering toward the barns. The barn, Caleb muttered, following the line of horsemen through his sights. They're after the stock. Without horses, this ranch is crippled. He shifted as if to go, but Lila caught his good arm. You're not fit to run. Caleb, you're half held together with stitches. I can't sit here while I'll go. Her words were sharp, decisive. I'm quick, and they won't be expecting me. Cover me. He opened his mouth to argue, but she was already grabbing spare ammunition. One look into her eyes, steady, fierce, told him nothing would stop her. Keep low, he growled. I will. Then she was out the back door, running in a crouch across the open ground. Bullets hissed overhead like angry wasps. Caleb's rifle cracked again and again, forcing the attackers to duck low in their saddles. Lila made the barn, slipping inside through the side door. Inside. The air was thick with dust and hay. Jed Turner and two ranch hands crouched behind a stack of bales, rifles ready. Their eyes widened at the sight of her, Miss McKenna. What in heaven's name? Jed began. We're defending what's ours. Lila cut him off. Her voice was iron. Through the barn's wide doors, she saw Grant's men lining up for a hard charge. Dust rose around them, sunlight glinting off gunmetal. And there at the front of the pack rode Silas Grant himself, tall in the saddle, smug in his arrogance. They'll run us over, Jed said grimly. 3 rifles can't hold against 20. An idea struck Lila. Desperate, dangerous, but it might be the only way. The horses, she said quickly. If we drive them out just as Grant's men charge, let the herd stampede into them, it'll scatter the riders. Give us a chance. Jed's eyes narrowed, then flickered with understanding. Could work. Could kill us, too. Better to try than die certain. She answered, without another word. They hurried down the line of stalls. Horses stamped and tossed their heads, sensing the violence outside. Lila's hand shook as she loosened latches. She whispered steadying words, though her heart thundered. On my signal. She told the men. Through a crack in the wall, she watched Silas Grant raise his arm. His riders leaned forward, spurring their mounts into a gallop. Dust boiled up, their yells cutting through the din of gunfire. Now, Lila cried. Shots fired into the rafters, and the ranch hands slapped flanks hard. Terrified horses burst through the doors, a wave of hooves and muscle. 20 half-maddened beasts crashed headlong into Grant's charging men. The prairie exploded with chaos. Screams of men and animals mingled as riders were thrown. Horses collided, dust choking the air. Lila glimpsed Silas Grant's stallion rear and pitch him into the dirt. Another rider tumbled headlong. The charge broke apart in confusion, men scrambling to avoid trampling hooves. Pick your shots, Jed barked. They fired carefully through the haze, dropping 2 more of Grant's hired guns before the rest wheeled away. Lila's lungs burned. She turned and saw smoke rising from the main house. The house. Jed pointed, his voice urgent. Lila didn't think. She sprinted out of the barn and across the yard, heedless of bullets, heedless of pain. Smoke thickened as she reached the kitchen porch. Inside, Caleb was already there, bandaged chest bleeding again as he fought flames with bucket after bucket. Stubborn fool, she gasped, grabbing another pail. Stubborn woman. he shot back, sweat dripping into his eyes. Together they doused the fire. The torch had caught the porch boards, but the blaze hadn't yet spread deep. They fought like warriors, side by side, until the last of the flames hissed into steam. Then a shadow filled the doorway. Silas Grant. His clothes were dusty, his hat gone, but his eyes blazed with hatred. He leveled a pistol at them, lips curling. "You should have sold when I gave you the chance," he sneered. His gaze slid to Lila. "Now I'll take the land. And the woman?" Caleb's voice was calm as winter ice. "The only thing you're taking is a bullet." Lila's stomach dropped. Caleb's gun lay across the room, out of reach. Silas smiled thinly. "From who you're unarmed. Boy, he's not alone." The voice came from behind. Amos Stone stepped into the room. His old Sharps rifle pressed hard into Grant's spine. "Drop it, Silas. It's over." For a breath. The world froze. Then rage twisted Grant's face. He tried to turn, gun swinging toward Amos. 3 shots rang out together. Silas jerked and spun. Lila's Colt smoked in her hand, the bullet grazing his shoulder. Amos's rifle barked, his round slamming into Silas's leg. Caleb's knife, thrown with deadly precision, pinned the pistol from Grant's grip. Silas collapsed, writhing on the kitchen floor. "Good shooting," Caleb said hoarsely, swaying against the wall. All of us. Outside, the gunfire dwindled. Without their leader, Grant's hired men scattered, chased by neighbors who had ridden in at the sight of smoke. The siege was over, the aftermath blurred. The sheriff arrived to clap irons on Silas Grant and round up what was left of his crew. "Doctor," Pike came again, stitching Caleb's torn wound, tending burns on Lila's hands, patching other injuries among the men. Neighbors were fed and thanked. Bonds of loyalty strengthened across the valley. When the sun finally dipped, Lila stood on the porch. The house bore scars, bullet holes pocked the walls, windows shattered, blackened board still smoked where the fire had licked. Yet the ranch stood. Stone Creek had endured. "We'll need to rebuild," Caleb said quietly, stepping beside her, his arm bound tight in a sling. His face was pale, but his eyes burned steady. "We will," she answered. The full weight of it hit her then. What they had survived, what they had nearly lost. Her knees buckled. Caleb caught her with his good arm, pulling her close. "Hey," he murmured, pressing his lips to her soot-streaked hair. "It's over. We're safe." "I shot a man," she whispered, voice raw. "I never thought." "You saved us," he said firmly. "All of us." Her laugh came out shaky, more sob than mirth. Is this what life will always be, fighting to keep what's ours? "Sometimes," he admitted, "but not always. Most days will be quiet. Breakfast on the stove, cattle in the fields, sunsets on the porch, children who'll test every ounce of our patience. Children." The word sent warmth through her chest despite everything. She looked up, eyes brimming. "If you want," he added softly. "When you're ready." She cupped his face with her burned hand. Today proved something. Caleb Stone. Proved what? That I belong here. This is my home. What we're building is worth every fight, every scar. She kissed him then, fiercely, without fear. "I love you, Caleb Stone." Caleb's words were still warm against her lips when the ranch yard filled with the clatter of supper pots and men calling to horses. Life was asserting itself over the ruins of battle, as if Stone Creek Ranch refused to bow to destruction. "Marry me soon," he whispered, voice rough with more than exhaustion. "I don't want to wait." Lila's answer came as natural as breath. "Next week," she said. Her eyes locked on his. as soon as you can stand steady for the vows. From the shadows. Toby Finch let out a jubilant whoop, and half the ranch likely heard it. Within minutes the secret was no secret at all. Word spread like fire through dry grass. Caleb Stone and the widow McKenna were to be wed. In the midst of pain and ash, joy had flared bright. That night, as she bound wounds and filled plates for neighbors who had ridden to help, Lila let her thoughts wander back. She remembered the woman who had once stood trembling in Holbrook, trying to trade her wedding ring for bread. That woman had been desperate, lost, hollowed out by grief. Now she carried a rifle's weight as easily as a skillet, faced down mercenaries without blinking, and kept a ranch running when death pressed at the door. She was not just surviving. She was building something that mattered with Caleb, with Amos, with every soul who had thrown in their lot with Stone Creek. Caleb found her later in the hallway, catching her arm gently. "You've been staring off again, thinking about gold," she said with a half-smile. He frowned, puzzled. Gold. How you were right. This land didn't need gold. It needed grit. She thought of the wedding band tucked away in a drawer, part of a life gone. It needed someone too stubborn to walk away. Caleb's eyes softened. It needed you. We all did. Tomorrow would bring endless work repairs to finish, fences to mend, stock to count, a wedding to plan while the walls still bore bullet scars. Silas Grant was finished, hauled away in irons, but others like him would always circle the prairie, hungry for what wasn't theirs. The frontier demanded vigilance as much as courage. But that night, with laughter drifting from the bunkhouse and smoke rising from the cook fire, Lila felt only gratitude. She had traded her ring for a chance at survival and found instead a life richer than gold love, belonging, and purpose. Winter gave way at last, leaving its ghosts behind. The patch walls gleamed with new boards, fresh panes of glass shone in the windows, and green shoots pushed through the thawed earth. Spring returned, relentless as hope. In Eleanor Stone's old room, her room now, Lila stood before the mirror, smoothing the cream dress she had stitched with her own hands. Simple cloth, but hours of embroidery along the collar and cuffs had turned it into something worthy of a bride. At her throat hung a locket Caleb had given her, a sprig of prairie grass inside, taken from the hill where his mother rested. "You look radiant," came a cheerful voice. Agnes Mallory bustled in, wrapped in her best Sunday dress, like a prairie rose after the rain. "I feel like I might faint," Lila admitted, pressing a hand against the butterflies rioting in her stomach. Agnes chuckled. "Every bride feels that way. Even I did, 40 years back. Though I dare say your young man's worse off. Last I saw, he was pacing the parlor like a wolf caught in a pen. Through the window, Lila glimpsed the yard transformed. Tables borrowed from neighbors sagged under food. Ribbons fluttered from posts. Wildflowers filled jars and buckets, spilling color across the gathering place. Half the county had come, eager for something bright after a season darkened by gunsmoke. A knock sounded. "Come in," Lila called. Amos Stone stepped in, stiff in his best suit, his weathered hands cradling a small wooden box. His voice was gruff, his expression carefully composed. This belonged to Eleanor. Her mother brought it from Ireland. She would want you to wear it. Inside lay a delicate pearl comb, yellowed slightly with age, but still gleaming. Lila's eyes stung as Amos tucked it into her pinned hair with surprising gentleness. "Thank you," she whispered. "No," Amos said, his voice low. "Thank you. You brought my boy back to life." You brought this whole place back. Eleanor would have loved you." He offered his arm. "Come on now. Let's not keep Caleb waiting. He's likely worn the floorboards bare." The walk from the house to the yard felt like both eternity and heartbeat. At the end of the makeshift aisle stood Caleb, tall and steady despite the sling at his side. His face, lit with wonder, erased her nerves. For that moment, there was no crowd, no danger, no past, only him. Toby Finch stood awkwardly at his side, trying for solemn but grinning too wide to succeed. Jed Turner and the hands, scrubbed and straightened, looked proud as any kinfolk. Even old Rosie the milk cow had been tied near the fence, a ribbon twined around her horns, as if blessing the occasion. The preacher from Holbrook kept the service simple, just as they had asked. He spoke of steadfastness, of vows that weather storms, of how love grows strong when rooted in hard soil. "Does anyone here object?" he asked finally. Silence fell, not the tense silence of battle, but one filled with respect. The ranch hands shifted their weight. Neighbors clasped hands. Children stared wide-eyed. No voice rose against them. Caleb took Lila's hand. "With all that I am, I pledge to you." Her heart swelled, "And I to you." The vows were spoken, the locket warm against her skin, and when the preacher declared them husband and wife, Caleb bent and kissed her in front of God and neighbor alike. Applause burst like thunder across the yard. Toby cheered so loud it startled Rosie, who lowed in protest. The feast that followed stretched long into the evening. Plates filled and refilled, fiddles played, boots stamped on the hard ground in dances that carried laughter high into the spring sky. Later, when lanterns flickered low and the stars blazed bright overhead, Caleb pulled Lila aside. His arm was still bound, his body still marked by scars, but his gaze held nothing but strength. "This is just the start," he murmured. She leaned into him, her heart steady as the prairie wind. "I know." And together they looked out over Stone Creek Ranch, scarred but unbroken, knowing that whatever storms the frontier brought, they would face them side by side. The celebration did not end when the preacher closed his book. It rolled on like the creek in spring, steady and bright. Music rose from a borrowed fiddle and a dented harmonica, and the men tried to remember their manners while the women pretended not to notice when they forgot. Children darted around table legs with sticky fingers and pockets full of buttons they had won at a ring toss. Ribbons lifted and settled in the mild wind as if the prairie itself was breathing along with the crowd. Caleb kept Lila near him as neighbors came to press her hands and wish them all that was good under the wide Kansas sky. Old Mrs. Whitlow brought a quilt she said had seen 3 weddings and twice as many winters. A blacksmith from the South Road offered a horseshoe he had hammered smooth for luck. Amos stood beside them, a little stiff in the suit that did not quite fit his broad shoulders, and nodded at each blessing as if he was counting them. By late afternoon, the shadows grew longer, and the talk settled into that soft hum a ranch makes when bellies are full and work is put aside for a rare hour. Someone called for a few words. Caleb glanced at Lila, and she gave a small nod. He climbed onto a wagon tongue, took off his hat, and spoke plain. A year ago his place was quiet in all the wrong ways. He said, "We had lost our heart." Then a woman walked through our gate and lit lamps again in rooms we had closed. She fed us. She stood a post when men came riding hard. Today, she took my name, and I reckon that makes me the luckiest man in Holbrook County. Lila felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she lifted her chin and let the moment stand. When folks looked to her for a reply, she kept it simple. "Thank you for coming. Your hands patched our walls and your prayers held us steady. Home is made of the people who stay when the wind blows. Mean. We intend to stay." That brought a cheer strong enough to set the lantern hooks trembling on the posts. Toby started clapping over his head until Jed cuffed him lightly and grinned. Even Amos allowed himself a thin smile before he set his hat back in place, as if that was quite enough foolishness for one day. The dance began again and went on until the rim of the sky burned orange, then softened to rose, then deepened to blue that swallowed every trail of smoke. When the last guest set out for home, Caleb and Lila walked the yard together while Jed and Toby doused the lanterns. The new boards on the house looked pale in the starlight. The patched panes winked like small, clear eyes. A cool scent rose from the earth where water had been thrown at the brief kitchen fire of that terrible morning weeks ago. It smelled clean now, like a page turned. Inside, the kitchen belonged to her more than ever. The table someone had planed smooth stood ready. The crock of sourdough she had coaxed back to life sat in its corner like a faithful watchman. A single vase of wildflowers from the creek rested on the sill. Lila set her fingers on the worktop and felt the grain. Solid oak, honest as the vows they had spoken. Caleb moved behind her and set his good arm around her waist. For a while they did not speak. They did not need to. Morning remembered them early. Ranches have a habit of doing that. Lila woke to the quiet before dawn and slid from bed while Caleb still breathed slow beside her. She pulled on her dress, tied her apron, and stepped into the kitchen, where the stove waited like an old friend. Coffee first, then batter for griddle cakes. Bacon laid in the skillet. The dog that belonged to everyone and no one thumped his tail beneath the bench and watched with solemn eyes. When the men tramped in at 5, they tried not to stare at the gold ring that flashed on her hand as she set plates down. Toby failed at not staring and then blushed furiously when Lila handed him the first tall stack with extra bacon slipped under the edge. Jed pretended not to notice any of it, but he ate in a way that told the truth. Amos came last. He stood in the doorway a heartbeat longer than usual and took in the room. The broom was back in its place, the dishpan scrubbed bright, the coffee set on a fresh cloth. He gave Lila a short nod. "Breakfast is fine," he said. "Thank you," she answered. The words were simple. The feeling behind them was not. After the meal, Caleb found her at the back steps brushing flour from her skirt. He looked younger in the morning light, even with the sling and the healing wound tight under his shirt. "We have a day ahead," he said. "The north fence still needs tending, and Jed says the yearlings keep testing the gate at the far pasture. Town waits for our list if we want lumber on the next freight. Think you can manage a crew of men who would rather eat than paint a porch post?" "I can promise them pie if the paint dries true," she said. "That ought to do it." They shared a smile that was more than a smile. Then he kissed her forehead and went out with Jed. Lila watched him cross the yard, sure in his stride, sure in his purpose. There was comfort in the sight. She turned toward the garden that had taken a beating from boots and stray embers and set to making order. Knees in the dirt, hands in the cool, rich soil. She pulled weeds and tucked new starts into place. By noon, the rows looked like they had always belonged. The sheriff from Holbrook arrived after the midday bell. Hat in hand, a dust line at his collar, an apology in his eyes. "Thought I should give you word," he said to Amos and then to Caleb and Lila when they had gathered by the porch. "The judge set a date to hear the claims on the creek. Silas Grant will not be there, but his lawyer means to argue you built beyond your right. Best bring what papers you have. Best bring witnesses who know the old markers. Amos stood very still. That water had fed Stone Creek since before he put his first post in the ground. He had cleared and dug and hauled in the seasons when there were no hands but his boys and one mule with more heart than sense. The notion of a stranger trying to unwind all of that in a calm room with a pen made heat crawl up his neck. "We will be there," Amos said. "Bring your judge a map only a blind man could miss." The sheriff tipped his hat and rode out. When the dust settled, Lila spoke first. "We will make our case plain," she said, "but men like Silas do not trust paper alone. Let folks see a ranch that is tended, a table that feeds a crew, a line of neighbors who will stand up when they are called. We will bring more than maps." Caleb looked at her as if a lock had slipped open somewhere in his chest. He had thought to protect her from the late tangle of legal tricks, but she was already part of the knot in the hands willing to untie it. That night Lila spread out the papers on the kitchen table, deeds with faded ink, a boundary survey scratched by a man long dead, a letter from a county clerk who had once boarded with the Stones before Holbrook was more than a muddy street and a church bell on a rope. Caleb set a straight edge down while Amos paced and tried not to pace. Toby leaned his elbows on the far corner until Jed pointed him toward the door and told him to check the latch on the smokehouse, instead of breathing on history. By lamplight, they traced the lines that mattered. Lila copied them in a careful hand on new sheets and added notes a judge could follow without squinting. She wrote like she cooked, steady and generous. When she was done, she stacked the pages and tied them with a narrow ribbon. It was the same ribbon she had worn in her hair the day of the festival. She smiled as she knotted it. 2 days later, they drove into Holbrook with the stack of papers, a basket of biscuits in case the morning ran long, and a quiet promise to stand together. Townfolk who had danced in their yard waved as they passed. Agnes Mallory shouted that she would keep a pot of stew on the back burner, whether they won quick or slow. The blacksmith lifted a hand that could bend iron and told Caleb to give that judge a look that would nail any lie to the floor. Court was held in the same square building where taxes were counted and wedding licenses signed. The judge was a spare man with a patient face. He listened while the lawyer for Silas droned about precedents and interpretation and the benefit of consolidating water under singular management. When he paused to wet his throat, the room felt like a coiled rope. "Your turn," the judge said to Amos. "I could talk about my boyhood," Amos said, voice low but clear. "I could tell you what the creek looks like when it jumps its bank in a hard spring, or how the mud smells when the drought finally breaks. But all that is wind." He put the old survey and the letter down, then Lila's clean copies. "We did not take what was not ours. We dug with our own backs. We paid what the county asked. When men came to steal by night, we fought them in the open. If that is not enough to hold a right in Kansas, then I do not know what is." The judge took his time. He read the papers. He asked 2 or 3 questions that went to the bone. Lila answered one of them, her tone even and respectful. She saw the corner of his mouth soften as she spoke and knew he had already decided, but was wise enough to let the decision settle inside him before he set it on the table. "Claim is affirmed," he said at last. "The creek remains with Stone Creek Ranch, as described in the original survey and as maintained by continuous use. The clerk will record it in the new book. Next matter." Outside the building, the sun was bright in a way that made people squint and smile at the same time. Caleb let out a breath that sounded like a door easing off bad hinges. Amos put his hand on his son's shoulder and then, after a pause, set the other on Lila's. He did not say a word. He did not need to. They drove home easy, wheels singing their small song over the ruts. When the ranch came into view, Toby ran out from the corral waving his hat so hard he nearly lost it. Jed followed at a walk, but his grin gave him away. Lila climbed down from the wagon with the papers safe under her arm and the basket empty, because the judge had taken a biscuit and then another, which had pleased her more than it should have. That evening the crew ate early and long. Someone found a scrap of fiddle tune, and the dog made his rounds in hopes of crumbs. After the dishes, Caleb led Lila past the barn, to the little rise where 3 simple markers stood among wild roses. He did not speak until they reached the top. "I wanted to bring you proper," he said. "Ma would have liked your steady ways. She would have liked the way you make a room feel used and right." Lila set her hand on his. She bent and laid a small cluster of creek flowers at Eleanor Stone's marker. "I will tend what she loved," Lila said softly. "Your father, you, this land, and if God grants it, any children who come after." Caleb went very still. Then he turned to her with a look that reached past the days they had already lived and into the ones waiting beyond the far fence. Hope was there. So was a quiet awe that felt like prayer. On the way back, they stopped at the corral where the mare Lila favored nosed her palm and sighed. The moon had climbed clear and high, silvering the new boards and catching on the window glass. The house looked both young and old in that light, as if every year it had stood was layered on the walls at once. They slept that night with the windows open to the soft wind. Before dawn, Lila woke to the faintest flutter in her belly. She pressed her hand there and lay very still. It might have been nothing but tiredness. It might have been something more. She did not speak of it yet. She only breathed and let a new kind of hope settle into place beside the old ones. Morning called again. Coffee, then griddle, then the door opening to boots and voices. She moved through the room she loved, the ring warm on her finger, the locket steady at her throat. Caleb stepped in from the yard with dust on his boots and light on his face, and for one clear moment Lila saw the whole of it as if from a ridgeline. The hard months behind, the good work ahead, the way love made all of it bearable and most of it sweet. Gold had never been the answer. A woman with a backbone and a heart had been. She smiled to herself and poured the first cup for the man who had said it plain long before the rest of the world understood. A meadowlark trilled from the fence post just as the preacher spoke the final words, and laughter rippled through the gathered crowd. Caleb's hands were steady as he slipped a plain gold band onto Lila's finger. It wasn't ornate like the ring from her first life, but it gleamed with the kind of truth only the prairie could forge. Solid, unadorned, and unbreakable. Just like the man who gave it. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared. "Caleb, you may kiss your bride." Caleb didn't need to be told twice. He pulled Lila close, kissing her so thoroughly the cowboys hooted and whooped, while the church ladies shook their heads with smiles they couldn't quite hide. When they finally parted, laughter spilled from them both, and the yard erupted into celebration. The afternoon blurred into a tapestry of sound and light. Fiddles screeched, a harmonica wove a wild tune, and Caleb spun Lila across the makeshift dance floor with surprising ease. She discovered he had been sneaking practice steps in the barn, and the thought made her laugh until her sides ached. Toasts followed, some eloquent, some comically blunt, especially after Hank from the neighboring spread uncorked his infamous corn liquor. Platters of food stretched across the tables, every ranch wife in the valley having contributed. The smell of roasted pork, fresh bread, and wild honey filled the air until even the dogs seemed drunk on it. As the sun dropped lower, painting the horizon in shades of rose and gold, Caleb tugged Lila away from the music and laughter. They climbed the small hill behind the ranch house, the one crowned with wild prairie roses that wrapped around 3 weathered crosses. Caleb's voice grew soft. "I wanted to bring you here," he said. Lila understood. She knelt by Eleanor Stone's grave and placed her bouquet of wildflowers against the marker. "I'll take care of them," she whispered. "Your husband, your son, this land you loved. I'll tend it as you would have wanted." The wind swept gently through the grass, and for an instant she could have sworn it carried approval in its touch. Caleb helped her rise and drew her against him. They stood in silence as the sun melted into fire along the horizon. "No regrets?" he asked. Her thoughts drifted back to the woman she had been not so long ago, standing desperate in Holbrook's store, ready to barter away the last piece of her past for a loaf of bread. That woman could never have imagined this moment her own land beneath her boots, a husband who saw her not for her desperation, but for her strength. A family stitched together from hardship and hope? None, she answered. Then she smiled, teasing, "Though sometimes I wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been in that store that day." Caleb's arms tightened. "I'd have found you," he murmured. "Some things are meant to be. Lila Stone." The name settled warm in her chest. Not a replacement for who she had been, but a new chapter. The widow who once clung to survival had become something else entirely. A wife, a partner, a woman standing tall in the life she helped defend. They walked back down to the ranch yard, hand in hand, where the celebration still roared. Calls went up for a speech. Caleb raised his brow toward her in question. She nodded. He stepped forward, voice carrying across the lantern-lit crowd. "A year ago, Stone Creek was fading. We had lost my mother, nearly lost the ranch, and I'd lost my way. Then a woman walked into our lives. She reminded us that gold isn't what keeps a ranch alive. What matters is grit, courage, the will to build something worth defending, and the grace to find beauty even in hard places." He looked at Lila, love written plain across his face. "What matters," she added, her voice clear and strong, "is finding people who'll stand with you when storms come, who'll teach you that home isn't about where you came from, but where you choose to plant your feet and grow." The cheer that followed rose so loud it seemed to roll across the prairie itself. The celebration lasted long into the night. Lila danced until her legs trembled, talked with neighbors until her throat was hoarse, and laughed until her cheeks hurt. Through it all, her eyes kept finding Caleb's, steady and sure, a compass in the happy chaos. Long after the last wagon had rattled down the lane and the bunkhouse had filled with tired hands, Caleb and Lila stood alone in the kitchen. Their kitchen, in their home. "Happy?" he asked, pulling her close. "More than I knew was possible," she admitted. Then she smirked. "But I should warn you, I still can't milk Rosie without her glaring at me like I'm a criminal." Caleb chuckled. "We'll work on it. We've got time. Time. Such a precious gift. Once, when Thomas lay dying, she had thought time had abandoned her. But time wasn't just about how long you had. It was about what you filled it with. Purpose, love, courage. Through the window, the stars wheeled across the endless Kansas sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, fences to mend, cattle to brand, a household to manage. But tonight, in the circle of her husband's arms, Lila felt the profound peace of belonging. She remembered again that first desperate moment in Holbrook, when a stranger's kindness had changed everything. Gold isn't what we need. You are. Caleb had seen her that day, truly seen her, and in doing so had helped her see herself. The wedding ring glinted in the lamplight plain, true, unpretentious. Upstairs, tucked safely away, Thomas's ring rested in a drawer, no longer a chain, but a memory she could honor without it weighing her down. She had learned to carry her past differently, like the roots of a tree. They did not bind her. They gave her strength to grow. "What are you thinking?" Caleb asked, sensing her quiet reflection. "About trades and bargains," she said softly, "and how sometimes losing everything is the only way to find what you really need." He kissed her then, tender and sure. When they finally climbed the stairs, Lila paused at the landing. She looked back at the kitchen, the heart of her new life, the sanctuary where she had found her strength again. Tomorrow she would brew coffee strong enough to rouse a crew of ranch hands, bake biscuits light enough to keep Toby grinning, wrestle with Rosie the cow, and tend the garden that kept them fed. She would do all of it, not as a desperate widow, but as Lila Stone, prairie wife, builder of a future forged in fire and love. The frontier had tested her and found her worthy. Now it was her turn to live the life she had fought for, a life of grit, grace, and promise. And what a life it would be. As we grow older, we begin to understand that life's greatest treasures are rarely the ones we can hold in our hands. This story of Lila and Caleb reminds us that gold, possessions, or wealth will never be enough to carry us through the hardest seasons of life. What truly sustains us is the courage to endure, the grace to forgive, and the love that binds us to others. For many who are past 60, this lesson resonates deeply. You've weathered storms, faced loss, and discovered that it wasn't the money in your pocket that got you through. It was the people who stood beside you, the strength you found in yourself when times were hardest, and the faith that tomorrow could be better. Lila thought she had lost everything when she offered her wedding ring for bread. Yet through that loss, she found something more enduring than gold, belonging, purpose, and love that gave her life new meaning. Perhaps that is the lesson for all of us, no matter our age. Life will test us, but if we meet it with courage and an open heart, it often gives back more than it takes. Thank you so much for spending your time with us and walking through this story. If it touched your heart, please show your support like this video, share it with someone you care about, and subscribe to our channel. Your encouragement helps us keep bringing stories of resilience, love, and hope to life. We're grateful to have you as part of this journey.